You guys ready for some fun? A little debate? A little dialogue? Come on! Yeah, come on, all right. So this is an interesting topic, obviously. The evolving role of privacy, especially in the dialogue we've had all day about digital transformation and what that really means, et cetera. Oh, not working?
He's been doing it a lot.
Everybody's mic working? Hello.
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 There we go. So, we thought we would put this together and give you a chance to hear from some of our assembled experts. And first, why don't we start with an introduction, and we'll start first with Victoria. Please introduce yourself, what you do, your title, and
Sure.
your background, if you would. Yeah.
Good afternoon, I'm Victoria Richardson. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the Australian Payments Network. The network is the industry body and self-regulatory body for payments in Australia. Most people know us as APCA. We recently rebranded. And as well as looking after the strategy for payments in Australia, I run the identity work that is being carried out by the Australian Payments Council. So the Australian Payments Council has the big four banks on it. It's got Coles, it's got Woolies, it's got the schemes, it's got technology providers. And one of the things we're looking at is how do we build a national digital identity framework.
Great. Thank you, Victoria. Cool. Richard.
Hi everyone, Richard Addiscott. I'm the Director of IT Planning, Governance and Security at Curtin University. Essentially what that means is I do a bit of everything, but essentially in this conversation my role sort of spans across the governance, and I'm also the Head of Information Security for the university. Curtin University is the 8th or 9th largest university in the country by student number, circa 60,000, and a very, very innovation focused. I'm also here because I think, from being the fact that we're a client of ForgeRock, we've gradually working out through their products over the last, 5 or 6 months, we've rolled out single sign-on and some other bits and pieces as well, which is going really well. So, the opportunity to come and talk about this sort of thing, I think for us is really important here as well.
Great, thanks, Richard. Marta?
Marta Ganko. I'm the National Privacy and Data Protection Lead at Deloitte. And I guess put quite simply, what I help organisations do is continue pushing the boundaries with the way that they use customers or individuals' data, but in a compliant way and in a way that continues to build that trust with their customers.
Peter.
Hi there, Peter van Dijk, Managing Director of Galexia. Look, we're a consulting organisation that's been in this space for about 15 years, consulting about identity and privacy. We managed to have a bit of we're locally based, but we have a bit of an international footprint. Look, our work with, to some extent, everything that's new in privacy is really old in privacy. A lot of the work that we've been doing, it's not the same, but there are very similar bunch of issues as the technology becomes ever more complicated and connected. So we've actually tried to fuse an identity consulting practice with a privacy advisory practice, and we've done many hundreds of what you call privacy impact assessments, typically helping Australian-based organisations with complicated privacy problems. Sometimes it's an education role, sometimes we sort of say to our clients, look, I'm going to try to stop you doing Australia card on purpose, but the only thing worse than that is doing it by accident. We also find ourselves, even though we have legal backgrounds, we're not the sort of, lawyer or computer says no. We often work with our clients to sort of say, well, actually, how can you roll out this service? How can you do it? In the environment we've found, we've gone from being, at the back of the consulting room where we've been told, oh look, you are but a thread in a blanket, we're not looking for a lighthouse on the hill solution, just tick the box, to the environment we find now where we're sought out for, we want independent consultants and advisors, and couldn't you put some more recommendations in? The Minister really wants to see some, surprisingly, negative comments and serious recommendations to help us do that. We're finding in identity in Australia, we've been trying to solve problems for government identity and service agencies and electronic health, achieve for all of our consulting life. So it's actually, the problem's actually quite significant, but we're finding now that we're actually beginning to get some cut through, and privacy is key, we'd say, to that, and key to an evolving sort of maturing data governance approach. And we listen a lot to what happens in the rest of the world, but we tend to be takers, not givers.
Thank you, Peter. So why don't we get started? So we just heard from Eve about how legislation many times becomes a catalyst to companies, commercial environments, government environments taking action. We've heard for the last 30 minutes about GDPR, its impact in the EU, potentially its impact on companies that do business in the EU. You've got the Privacy Act here and a bunch of other elements that are occurring all at the same time. How does Australia think about not only the GDPR Act, but how do companies and how does government think about this? How should we be thinking about this? And what are you seeing today out in the market in Australia and New Zealand? Maybe Marta, if you can start us off on this, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think Australian organisations are definitely not where they need to be at the moment. We're talking about May 2018 when the GDPR comes into effect, and that's not a lot of time to implement requirements that are quite onerous on organisations, and the Europeans are learning from this right now. But if we take a look at the journey that Australian organisations have been on, particularly in the last 5 years, so 2014 was when we had the unified Australian principles come into effect, and a lot of organisations implemented programs to ensure to be compliant by that March 2014 deadline. So that was already a lot of work, and it took 12 months for organisations to comply with that. But then it stopped. And so all of a sudden, we have the GDPR and other global regulations that potentially some of you may need to comply with, and all of a sudden you're trying to work out, how do we do this? How do we make sure that we're compliant with all of these regulations around the world? And I think that GDPR is almost becoming a gold standard for organisations. And the reason for this is because it encourages continuous risk management. So where the APPs or the Australian privacy principles, organisations may have implemented them and may not necessarily be ensuring compliance against them, under the General Data Protection Regulation, continuous risk management is a requirement. I think where we are in the conversation at the moment here is whether the GDPR does apply to my organisation. And it's not an easy question to answer because the Europeans have not made it easy for any organisation at all. So while we know that the regulation has a global territorial scope, we also know that it applies to EU data subjects. And how do you define that as an organisation? So you can start off by measuring your risk exposure, how many EU citizens do I have? But it could be a person that is, seconded from your organisation somewhere overseas. It could be someone on a working visa transacting with your financial services institution. The scope of its application is not very well understood by organisations. And I think if I think about some of the conversations I'm having with our clients at the moment, it's about, one, does it apply to us? And two, what are our gaps? What do we actually need to address and do so that we're compliant by May 2018?
That's great. Marta, anybody else?
Just to
Sure.
pick up
Sorry.
that I think in this market, while at the moment we're looking at GDPR, we've just had the Productivity Commission's inquiry into data availability and use. So we're about to face all those questions here. So I think some of the discussion around GDPR is really helpful as a precursor to Australia to think, what will we do? And from a payments perspective, I think there are some really interesting challenges. So if I pay you some money, we've both created that data, and that data is recorded in my bank account. In fact, you had a fantastic demo earlier on where even if it's user consent, so there's a little button in my mobile banking app or online banking, and it says, let me share this data. Right. Do I have your consent to share the fact that I made this payment to you every week for the last year. So I think some of those, how do you implement it, is really something to think about. And we don't have the answers. Oh, I don't think we have the answers. Perhaps you do, but I don't think we do.
From a university perspective, and picking up on the thread of those, I mean, like a lot of people in the room, I'm sure we've got queries coming out from our legal and compliance people to our external counsel saying, how is this going to impact us? And I'm asking the question internally as head of information security, and with a very strong role in planning our overall IT platforms, in making sure that we're prepared for that, and knowing the timeframes that are coming up very, very quickly. Is something that I'm trying to get a bit of extra wriggle, bit more momentum being tracked in by our legal and compliance people. I think, like any university that has an international student cohort, if we're selling degree courses into Europe, into European citizens, it's likely that if there is an impact from an Australian legislation perspective, then we're going to be subject to those sorts of things as well. I think taking up the point about the APPs and the Australian privacy principles, I think there's some nuances in there as well when we think about that GDPR really talks around building security in by design and building it in from the ground up. The continuous risk assessment, the APPs from my reading aren't explicit in that. It takes all reasonable steps to ensure the security. It doesn't specifically talk around making it absolutely fundamental that you build it in from the ground up. So there's some nuances that I think Australian organisations need to pick up on, and it's where does it sit? And the other challenge we have, of course, is that universities, or certainly my university, isn't actually subject to the Privacy Act. There's no legislation in WA which specifically deals with privacy at the moment. So as a university, we've taken a view that society expects us to treat their data with a degree of protection and a degree of security. So from our perspective, we've taken a voluntary choice to adhere to the principles of the Australian Privacy Act because it makes good business sense from our perspective. And the other challenge, I think, in picking up on Marta's point is, what does it mean for us? And if I am in breach, what actual right does the EU actually have on enforcing a penalty on me as an Australian organisation? And the discussion that we're having is around the licence to operate in the European market. Aside from all the reputational damage and all those sorts of things, they're the sorts of things, and it might not be 4% of your global total revenue, but if they say, well, we're not going to fine you, but you know what, you can't do business here anymore, you can't sell degree courses to European students, that's a significant slice of the university's international revenue that we need to be mindful of.
Peter?
Yeah, look, our work is predominantly, in privacy and identity work is predominantly Australian focused. So the GDPRs aren't immediately relevant in our world to Australian government organisations or state government organisations trying to roll out an identity platform. Our experience and looking at the privacy framework in Australia is it's actually full of quite a lot of political compromises. There isn't too much law in it. There are principles and there is always there's guidance, but some of the main areas that touch upon identity, like enrolment or audit logging or things like that, are really the subject of guidance, best practice guidance, better practice guidance, and that varies depending on what agency you're living in. What we've seen with Australia is what happens in Europe rattles around, and we eventually adopt some of that. There are quite a lot of compromises in the Australian Privacy Act that we haven't adopted. In Australia, employee records are exempt from the Privacy Act. Now that's due to political compromises. Is that likely to be changed anytime soon? Probably not. There are a plethora of inquiries that do drive down from the original financial services inquiry that suggested and government adopted about a national digital identity framework in which government and industry credentials could be shared to do business. And everything you can sort of see that's happening from there with digital transformation agencies, trusted digital identity framework, through to the open data inquiries, through to the parliamentary inquiry that mandates, API level access to bank accounts and talk of, customer initiated data sharing, all comes from that. Does the GDPR influence that? Certainly the debate around that influences that. We are late global adopters in having a data breach notification, and some of our data breach requirements are not as strong as other jurisdictions. So I suppose it's relevant in some of the standards that we eventually adopt and some of the inquiries we're running. Will there be, LAW law changes in the near future? Well, not with the current government.
I was just going to add into that. You mentioned, Peter, around Australian government agencies and the way that they operate and the guidance that's coming out from OAIC, etc., etc. I guess what I'd really love to see is most Australian federal government agencies have to adhere to the Information Security Manual and all those sorts of things in terms of their technical security. So the question I'd love to see is, wouldn't it be great if you had the OAIC actually link their guidance to the ASD to make it really easy to determine that all reasonable steps look like this if you're this type of agency. And if you're adhering to the ISM and you've been IRAP accredited for your environment, that by default, you are you're operating in a manner which is compliant to GDPR and the Privacy Act. That level of joined-uppedness in government isn't there, and I think Drew, who's sitting in the audience over there, he and I spent a year working at the National Security CIO's office talking about exactly that, sharing our safeguarding identity data across agencies. And the level of discussion we would be having around why some agencies wouldn't talk to each other. They've got different legislative acts, both got top secret clearances, but you know what, mine's better than yours, so I'm not going to share my identity data with you. So these are the sorts of things that we're dealing with, and it'd be great for I go back to that point. If ASD and the Australian Privacy Commissioner were to provide joint guidance or joint standards which sort of allowed government agencies to take that forward, might give them, it might make it a little bit easier to transition.
So we're talking a lot about government's impact, their role, their influence. You know, I guess it bears the question, do you have an opinion about what is government's role around citizen identity and what should they or could they be doing? Anybody want to lead with that?
I think in many markets they've provided a helpful stimulus to get the market going. So in the UK you saw the government saying we'll create a market for identity. I'm not sure how successful they've been in that actually. And then in other markets you see in Estonia where there's a national identity, it really has created a really interesting system where people use their ID cards to go on the bus, but it's not applicable to many markets. And I think in this market, without the stimulus of the government, where the government has said, yep, we're going to do this, and then we've all waited, and so it hasn't happened. And without that stimulus, what happens? How does the private sector stand up and say, actually, we've got real problems, we've got online fraud, and if you saw the Sydney Morning Herald a couple of weeks ago, it's going through the roof. It's fastest increase that there's ever been. And data breaches, cybersecurity issues, a sophisticated digital identity framework is actually an antidote to many of these problems. But without the government stimulus, it's interesting to understand how the private sector will come together.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree.
I guess my question would be, why do we need to wait for the government to do anything? Why doesn't the private sector take control? So if we take a look at Google or Facebook or any one of those social media platforms that are available to us, really they are taking control of our identities and how that information is used and shared with others beyond our control. And I think the reason we're having this discussion today is because there needs to be some control around what they do with our data as well. So I guess my question would be, there are organisations and social media platforms are only one example. There's lots of data brokers, large reporting bodies, even in Australia, that have the potential to become identity holders of our data as well.
Sure. Any other opinions? Thoughts?
Well, quite simply, government will not accept social media credentials to obtain benefits from government. And I mean, one thing we find ourselves in Australia is we have a really messy federation. And we've got 3 tiers of government, and even with the split provision of services across them. So Australia has a fraught history in sharing data and sharing identities and credentials. My observation about GDPR is Europe has, and there are historical and political reasons why they have such strong privacy. Germany might be one of the strongest in the world because of what happened in the Second World War. What's happened in Europe with GDPR is we have a history of strong privacy in an environment where America doesn't have a strong privacy regime, but they are the providers of the software, the platforms, and Europe is, well, on one level they're concerned about the citizen data. On another level you could cynically say there's an opportunity to tax cross-border data transfers coming from the States. We actually did a study, actually for Digital Europe, about what's the value of the transfer of personally identifying data between the States and Europe. And the number was astoundingly high. So I said, oh, don't let the EU politicians know about that. Yeah. And then in Australia, we sort of sit a little bit in the middle of that. So maybe the Productivity Commission is this concept of maybe access data as a nearly a commercial right.
It's an asset. They say
yes,
it's an asset.
And it's an asset for people to use in the area of health research. Well, that's the goal, health research and joining up and learning things in that data. But it also may be seen as an asset for me as a consumer to move around from supplier to supplier. And there are reasons why incumbent banks wouldn't want that to happen, but then there are also drivers in a strong fintech industry of why they would want that to happen and why we may want a sort of national, know your customer, financial sort of identity infrastructure.
So certainly in the fintech world, the financial markets, this whole dialogue about, for many of the banks, about do they partake or not in some type of identity repository proofing mechanism, whatever it happens to be, all over the world. Along with that comes this whole dialogue about open banking. And certainly the PSD2 standard and what's happening there. I'm curious if anybody has an opinion about open banking, what that means to Australia in particular.
We're about to find out because there's a review into it at the moment that Scott Farrell's leading. And I think what was interesting is that in the budget speech, the Treasurer came out and said not that he was going to lead an inquiry into whether to implement open banking, it was how to implement open banking. And to implement that by 2018. So I think that we're about to find out. But I think the discussion that we're having earlier is that perhaps some of the, maybe it's unhelpful discussion in this market is that we've looked at what's happening in Europe and there's this sort of a sense of perhaps it's a bit unimplementable. I keep hearing people say that, we don't want to do what they've done in Europe, it's unimplementable. And so I think that perhaps we'll see a more pragmatic approach in this market of a phased approach. Perhaps there are some mechanisms at the moment that exist where banks make their customers' data available, and perhaps we'll see those as the building bricks, and then we'll move out to something that is more in line with what we might think open banking is. But I think we might see a phased, pragmatic approach here rather than some principles and some really loose standards and then an invitation to go and implement it.
I think for me, and we had this discussion earlier as well, is around using the need for greater competition in the sector to drive as a means and open banking as a mechanism to make that occur. I'm still a little bit dubious as to what impact it's going to have on the day-to-day customer in terms of their willingness to switch between banks, and I think until we can get a harmonised view of ANZ's basic checking account versus Westpac's and what it actually means to switch in a real-time way, being able to have common metadata in terms of how that identity transitions across is another thing. And I think the other thing that's interesting is that some research coming out of the UK around people's propensity to switch banks, and not even if there was a massive scandal with that bank would they be willing to switch unless it was actually directly impacting them. To the point where the UK's sort of market regulatory body was saying only about 3% of people actually switch banks every year. In Australia, it's not that much higher. Okay, so really at the end of the day, people, I think, it comes down to convenience, it comes down to general apathy around where their money's sitting. It's too hard to move mortgages, it's too hard to, I've got lots of money sitting in term deposits. Unless that rolls over or I've got another loan that needs to be looked at, there's probably not a trigger there, and I don't know if necessarily opening up APIs and an iSelect type process for your banking is going to necessarily encourage people to switch. So I guess the question for me is, are we trying to find a solution to a problem that doesn't necessarily exist? And IT is really good at doing that. So I think that's probably the question for me with this one. I'd also like to see how this might apply as a future use case for Open Student and the ability for students to transition between universities with a full understanding. If I'm going to go from Australian National University, USyd, and I want to switch business courses, what's the academic penalty, what's the fee structure going to look like, all again on one page. And that data is quite rudimentary, you can go and find it, but it simply talks about number of students, expecting starting salary, all that basic sort of metadata, but it doesn't actually tell the user exactly what the impacts of that cost would be on one page. And I think the competition in the sector would be it'd be incredibly disruptive to the university sector if that sort of thing was brought to bear from a student ID perspective.
Mike, an interesting figure about education sector in Australia is I think per capita we have one of the highest incomes for actually selling student courses. Like it's actually a really significant...
it's the third largest exporter in the country.
Yeah.
It's higher education.
So actually it's actually, when we talk about, a lot of the work is very insular and Australian focused, but when you look at the universities, they actually do have a sort of need for global identity perspective.
Please.
Can I disagree with something?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
No,
Because,
you're supposed to.
Because I think it's a bit, it's distilled too much to say that open banking is, I know you didn't say this, but just about account switching. And I have to say that I contravene my bank's terms of services and I use Acorns because it's an interesting service that my bank doesn't offer. So making an API available to do that so that it's done in a secure way with my consent so my bank can check some digital certificate and know that that's Acorns, not pretend Acorns. That's really important to me, actually. So I would, maybe I would move accounts to bank with someone that understood that I don't get all my core services from the bank. I don't shop from the same shop. And I think that the generation of consumers coming behind us expect choice. And why wouldn't a bank accept that there are some niche players that offer niche services that it's not in the bank's core interest to develop a service to, but absolutely they should enable me to access that service. So
that's a really good point.
I think, moving over to see it from the organisation's perspective, regardless of an open, whether it's an open banking or an open data environment, the risk management approach of organisation needs to shift. So we're talking about a real-time risk management environment. You need to be able to identify a customer, know that is a person that's transacting, process that payment at the same time. This is something that we don't really do here in Australia yet, and we're about to see in October when the National Payments Platform comes out and is implemented. And that is going to be a game changer for a lot of organisations where consumers' expectations are going to start rising because they're going to expect to be able to pay someone now within a couple of seconds. And organisations are going to have to rise up to the challenge and deal with that as well. So just to add to Victoria's point around, these are services that everyone is going to want to use and they're going to be built, the data's going to be available. So we, as organisations, we really have no choice but to compete and rise up to that challenge, otherwise we're going to just diminish.
Yeah, I think one of the areas that we certainly see some inquiry from large companies that are doing a lot of IoT work is, especially if it's consumer related, are there ways to create payment streams that are frictionless, that don't involve credit card companies and other elements of normal processing, and bake that into the actual process itself or the workflow itself of upgrading or upselling a particular product to an individual like the basketball, et cetera. Do you really want a normal organic payment stream to occur, or do you want something more innovative that's tied to an API, an open API in some way, shape, or form? Shifting totally, we talked a little bit about AI and what that means around GDPR, well, consent in particular, and how does that correlate? And Marta, you had some interesting thoughts around this. Maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, so I guess what I was saying before was that the way or the current way that organisations are implementing AI is going to be really challenging when it comes to GDPR compliance, because there's a lot of expectations there around the right to be forgotten, explicit consent, and all of a sudden these AI agents are going to have to stop and think, can I actually do this? And then execute on the process or the task that they are to execute. And so, one of the articles I read the other day, which I thought was just scaremongering, was, does this mean that AI is illegal under the GDPR? Absolutely not. But what it does mean is that it's going to encourage organisations to really think differently. And I think we're about to see a revolution around consent, because when I see chatbots, and I see some of the chatbots that are being implemented at the moment, you can't rely on a tick in the box consent anymore. You can't even necessarily have granular consent after the fact, after the transaction's been completed. So you're really talking about educating, notifying, and obtaining consent while you're having a conversation with a customer via that chat conversation. And that's going to be an exciting, I think it's going to be an exciting 12 to 24 months to see how organisations transform themselves to be able to deal with that.
I think that sums it up really well, and I think there's also another part of the conversation around AI and stretching into the IoT market is, what are the AI vendors going to do to enable GDPR? It's not just about the innovators who want to roll this stuff out and implement IBM Watson and they're done. What's IBM actually going to do to make sure that when they roll Watson out to their clients, that they're setting them up in a way which is compliant from day one, rather than, and really hand-holding the clients through that implementation, because they should have the expertise internally to make sure that their product is being installed in a way that not only meets the business requirement, that's of course if you haven't included security as a business requirement, but quite often, we kind of tend to find that gets left to the last minute and bolted on at the back end. And so I think there's a role here for the vendors to play in terms of making sure their solution stacks are actually starting to meet the global regulatory environment as much as they can possibly.
Yeah, totally the case. I think one of the items we were going to chat about was also IoT. And IoT is really interesting because I think everybody in the room knows much of this, most of devices, including current generation, have not been architected for great security for devices, machines, things, et cetera. How do we think about consent with devices, both consumer as well as other, industrial, medical, et cetera? Yeah.
So I think first off, my opening, when I was thinking about this particular question, I find it ironic as a security person that, we've built the internet and we're now starting to backwards engineer it to be secure. And we had a real opportunity with the lessons learnt with the internet to start thinking about security being built into IoT and sensors and actuators far earlier than what we have do. And the speed to market that it's happening is causing a key challenge. I think from a privacy perspective, I think there's multiple viewpoints we need to take, and I touched on it before. There's the sensor manufacturer, there's the chip manufacturer, there's the brand of the manufacturing device. So if it's a Fitbit or a whatever, what role do they have to play? What role does the person who is actually wearing the device have to play in that entire end-to-end privacy spectrum? Where does the obligation actually lie? And I think it really is an end-to-end sort of thing. I think the trick is finding that equilibrium, and that's going to be a very difficult thing to do. One of the things that I am seeing, and I think in more large-scale IoT deployments, is some work that Data61 are doing. And I don't know if there's anyone from Data61 in the room, but they've got two things that they've done recently which I think will have a really positive impact in this space. And the first one is a modular IoT platform that enables sensors of any particular type to communicate securely over what they call a datagram transport layer security protocol. So they've built a protocol to be able to manage the security and the connectivity and the communications between a multitude of sensors, which is really great. The other thing that they've looked at, and Peter touched on, is something that he's done a while ago as well by the sounds of it, is that they've come up with the concept of confidential computing, and bear with me, federated privacy preserving analytics platform. So one of the key things that we worry about with identity and identity sharing and information sharing is around encryption, and obviously making sure that only people have access to that, PKI and all those sorts of things in terms of who can see what. What Data61 have built is this particular technology, I don't know if people have heard of it, it's called homomorphic encryption. So I don't know if there's anyone heard of that in the room before? Okay, which is great. So what that actually is the ability to sensors and those systems that are producing calculations and analysis to be done on ciphertext without having to decrypt it first. So when we're talking about humour and we're talking about the interconnectivity and identity sharing, the ability for that analysis to be done at the same time as preserving the customer's identity data in an encrypted form is pretty cool. So I think there's some real opportunities in that particular space as well. So I think that's probably where I would that's my view on it anyway. I'll shut up.
I suppose when we hear about IoT, and once again, it's not something that comes up a lot in Galexia's privacy advisory work. It is certainly coming up in identity strategy work. But I suppose I listen, all these home devices and office devices that are sitting there listening to you. Well, they don't just raise privacy issues, they raise obvious security issues. Who's listening to what? I suppose it's not, and the thing about identity, it's not the identity of the devices themselves, it's what are they collecting and who's consented to that. And I am going to throw this, sorry Mike, I don't mean to take a job. I'll throw this to Victoria, who was talking about, and you were talking about, was it a...
I was going to say, if your Amazon Alexa, it's not listening to anything unless you ask it again and again and again, then it admits, oh yes it was, and there was this case in the US.
Right, sure.
And then they did give up the data, but there was a murder case and the Amazon Alexa was on collecting ambient information. And then it was only when the person who was the accused in this case said, yeah, actually, can you give up the data, because I think it will support my case. And we have no way of answering that at the moment, do we?
So we haven't had these, they've emerged
Amazon claimed
on the market.
its First Amendment right, didn't it? You think, what, a machine has a First Amendment right? But it's true, that's really what...
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to, what are the securities policies, consent, regulation, all of those things around the devices and things. You think about the connected home, right? And you think about the smart thermostat and the smart security cameras and all of these coming together without any regulation, without any, common tech around the access to the data off it is scary and is almost prescribing that something be done about framing this up. Yeah.
Marta, you go. I've got something, but after you.
I was going to say, there's a perfect example of that 2 weeks ago in the news. You probably would have heard about iRoomba, the smart vacuum cleaner. And, we're talking about consent, but we're also, there's a practicality element. So how were people that have bought these smart vacuum cleaners supposed to be notified that their data was going to be, or that floor plans of their homes were being created? There's no interface on a smart vacuum cleaner. So these are still questions and challenges that I think as a world, we have to answer.
The IEEE is doing a lot of work around the ethics of that, aren't they? I mean, they're
Underwriters Laboratory.
But but I think there's a lot of work going on in that area to think about.
Listen, I want to save a few minutes for some Q&A. Hopefully you have some good provocative questions for the panel. Why don't we get started? Anybody have a question? Right here? We have a microphone coming your way.
Victoria, could you tell us a bit more about the digital ID and the scope of that and where it's up to?
Where it's up to. So the payments plan, which was published a couple of years ago now, says that we'll work in close cooperation with the government. It links back to the Murray report that says government needs to work with the private sector. I think I'll be really honest and say that we've done a lot of education, we've done a lot of studies around other markets, what is that catalyst for standing up a framework. And we're at the point where the Payments Council acknowledges that it's really important. I think that one thing that's sharpening the focus is this open banking and open data. You can't give access to data if you don't know who's asking for the access or which company. So I think that's really helped sharpen the focus. I think until that happened there possibly wasn't the commitment to solve the problem as an industry. I think that some organisations still have it in the competitive compete bucket. If you think, lots of industry work is what goes in the collaborate bucket, what goes in the compete bucket, and some things move between them. For some organisations, identity is still a competitive issue, but I think increasingly less so. And I think that over the course of the next few months, we'll see some movement there.
Great, thank you. One over here. Simon, you got it?
Yeah. Marta, you suggested earlier that many Australian businesses are probably not prepared for GDPR, given the timeframes. What advice would you give for, given that the GDPR text is long, there's a lot of stuff that you need to do, breach notification, right to be forgotten, consent, all these things. What advice would you give for companies which may struggle to get over the line by that time in terms of risk mitigation, picking the right things to do first?
Yeah, so I guess probably the first piece of advice that I would give is understand what you can't do or where your gaps are and prioritise those. It is going to be impossible in some cases to become compliant by May 2018. I'm not going to sugarcoat it at all, because depending on what type of organisation you are and the complexity of your business, not just your solution architecture, but also your business activities, it can take a while to actually sift through that. And I know organisations that have spent a year just getting consent from customers again. And these are large multinational companies that have known from day one their risk exposure is there, so they've had to go and do something. So definitely understand where your gaps are and then prioritise them in terms of your organisation's exposure. So if you're an organisation that holds a lot of payment information or sensitive information such as health data, you might want to focus on those activities that involve that type of data first, rather than doing a broad data discovery exercise to try and figure out where all of your data is. That takes a long time as well. Keep it focused to where most of your risk is going to be.
Great, thank you. Another, right in the back. Yep.
What kind of impact do you think the GDPR on staff monitoring, like if you're doing any behavior analytics or security analytics for that purpose, and what kind of consent do you need from staff? Is it going to be like contractual, written in the contract? If you sign that off, then okay, we can collect that information. So what is your view about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So employee information does fall under the GDPR, and it is probably the highest focus amongst organisations here in Australia, because it's probably something that has been kind of left aside. So yes, it does mean that employee information needs to undergo the same risk assessment processes that any of your customer data does. It also means that your employees will need to know about what information about them is potentially being used for any monitoring activity.
Great. One more? Any? Again, a repeat. Last question.
We talked in the previous session about one of the something related to GDPR was the cross-border data transfer for personal data. Now, I'm aware there's various ways which can happen. One of them being Privacy Shield. Now, I'm also aware that Privacy Shield is up for review soon, and there's talk of maybe it won't survive the review, or there may be changes. I guess I just wanted to ask the panel if they had any opinion on where Privacy Shield was going and how to, if you're a company that relies on it, how to assess that risk.
Do you want to go?
Well, I'll put up my hand. People might not believe this, but it was one of my co-directors, our co-directors, Chris, who was actually responsible for destroying the EU-US safe harbour. I recall at the time in 2007 we had a room of researchers, and this was the mechanism that US used to make sure they could sort of exchange data about Europeans back to the States. And we had a team of researchers, law students, who sucked down every privacy policy of every company making claims under self-harbour. And it's one of this, it was a very much self-regulated scheme that wasn't really oversighted by the US FTA. And I mean, we found, I'd say a pool of 3,000, 10% had the identical old, out of date and wrong Facebook privacy policy. And to some extent, Galexia was the prior of US businesses because essentially what happened with the, I suppose, the destruction of the safe harbour scheme and arrival of the privacy shield was because of what we did. And I know my business partner would spend his time lodging cases with the FTA of companies making false claims. The result of that is there's been, Privacy Shield is seen as being perhaps a better solution or a better approach. As to what will happen in GDPR, I don't think anyone's got any sort of particular insight to that. No.
I guess the Privacy Shield is not legally binding and it's a self-certifying scheme. So organisations say themselves that they are compliant under that scheme. I guess, as Peter pointed out, it still remains to be seen whether it does, whether it is accepted by the Europeans, and it is under review. But there is talk that there's really not that much difference from the previous safe harbour scheme as well.
Great. Well, let's wrap it up there. Let's have a big hand of applause for our panel members.